friends, welcome. Thank you for coming. Good evening.
Good evening.
Glad that I was fearing a low turnout, right? Because you're coming to be told you got problems as a white person. But that's what church people do. There's kind of this masochistic streak that we have in us, right? So, really glad that you've come. We have two events this month, actually, that are of great interest. So one is tonight, and we'll talk about that in a second. In 2 weeks, on February the 16th, we have a really cool program. Dorothy Counts, who is fairly well known as the first African-American student to walk into a white school here in Charlotte back in 1957. And now she's a community activist, is doing some pretty amazing things, has gotten to be real good friends with my wife. And she's going to be with us. Eric Davis, who is our school board representative, will be here. Sandra Conway, who's another community do-gooder, will be with us. We're going to be talking about racial equity in our schools and our children, and really important stuff. Tonight will be actually a good segue into that, so I want you to join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon Sullivan. Thank you. Shannon is, she's been a year and a half here at UNC Charlotte and is the head of the philosophy department there. That's right. Yes. And we're just so glad that you've come to talk to us tonight, to share with us, have a conversation about things. She has a book that some of you tracked. It's called Good White People. I believe John Clarkson or Ron Knapp, one of you two, were reading this book and said we've got to have her come, and she's here. So this is the fruition of a bunch of things, which is good. So Shannon, first thing I just want to ask you just a couple things about yourself. Where are you from?
I grew up in Texas, West Texas, but I haven't lived there. Am I too loud? Am I okay?
You're good.
I haven't lived there since I did my undergrad there, and after undergrad have moved away. But I still have family in Texas, so I get back there some.
Okay, and where'd you do graduate school?
I did my graduate work, my PhD and master's at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And then from there, my first job was in Ohio, and then to Pennsylvania, Penn State. And now back to the South, and that's a very happy thing.
We Southerners welcome Yankees, Texans, just everyone.
I make sure people know I'm from Texas. I'm not from Pennsylvania, actually.
Yeah, we don't count Texas as the South, but
But we seceded with you, so it counts.
Now that "we" is interesting, isn't it? Anyway, never mind. All right, so I have a few little talking points that I want to talk with you about and see what you have to say. And she and I are going to have a conversation, and we're going to leave some time at the end for your questions and comments, so that'll be fun. And the first thing I want to talk about with you, Shannon, is this is really interesting. In a way, what you do in this book is the same thing that I do, is I try to help people realize things they do not realize about themselves, right? In a way, I've been this week grading papers for would-be clergy who want to be ordained. And one of the things they write very badly about is human sin. And what they think human sin is when you intentionally do something that you shouldn't do. And maybe that is sin. But actually, the more insidious, dangerous sin is the sin that you're not aware of. The attitude that is hidden inside you. You may even think you're noble. You may even think you're cool. You may think you're right. But actually, you're just so very wrong. And it occurs to me, you talk about things that we're not conscious of. I remember when I was pastor in Davidson 13 years ago, moved here from there. And we used to have, when the new freshman class would come in, we would do little small groups with them so they could talk and such. And one of the questions we always asked at the beginning is we would say, talk about your ethnicity. And now these are bright white students. The white students inevitably would say, I don't have ethnicity, which is funny. They were trying hard, but they couldn't identify their whiteness as their ethnicity. On page 72 of your book, you say this amazing thing. You say that the racism of years ago lives on in the unconscious desires, fears, and beliefs of well-intentioned white people today. Now, we don't like to think that. We like to think that we're enlightened and we're progressive. And as I said in my sermon yesterday, I hear people all the time who say, I'm colorblind, I'm colorblind. We don't realize what lives inside of us. So talk a little bit about this kind of unconscious self that we carry that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, so how I got into thinking about some of this, I won't take too long of a track to get directly to your question, but I don't really have a background as an activist. I feel like I ought to say that. I certainly support activism. I got here as a philosopher, thinking about myself and who I am and the relationship with the world, those kind of classic big questions. And thinking about myself, or just selves in general, as bodily. We have bodily selves. And then that led me into thinking a lot about things like gender and race, and do those have anything to do with who and what I am? And it's the bodily part that's important for me, although I'll get to beliefs as well. But you're right that I'm less interested in people's intentions. And I have good intentions. I bet most of you have good intentions. Lots of us have good intentions. But that our unconscious beliefs, and sometimes those are enacted in bodily reactions that we don't consciously intend, that a lot of times that kind of betrays or reveals other sorts of beliefs that are housed in your body, if that's one way. I really, in the end, don't want a big mind-body split. I also don't want to get into heavy metaphysics about mind-body relationships. But that in the ways we move, hold our bodies, react to other people, a lot of our beliefs, even though we may consciously don't want to show it, there's this classic one that one philosopher calls the elevator effect. So a white woman's on the elevator by herself, and a black man gets on, and she's in that closed space with him. And African-American philosophers will talk about the tightness in their bodies, the women's bodies, maybe even just slightly holding your purse a little closer into your side. Maybe you actually smile to show this is a friendly, it's kind of make sure this bodily reaction that happens, that even though you don't want to be racist, you don't want to look at a black man and think, is he a criminal? Is he going to do something to me? And you will hear black man after black man, if they'll talk to you about this, they'll tell you about this. And one of those philosophers, he can be in his suit with his name tag at the conference, and a white woman will tense up, and she won't mean to, but her body is saying, I'm scared of you, and my world teaches me to be scared of you. And it's not even, of course it's an individual reaction, but it's more than that. It's something our whole world teaches all of us to see black men in particular as criminals. And so your body tells a story sometimes that society doesn't want to hear, that maybe we consciously don't want to hear. So there's where some of those unconscious beliefs are, yeah.
And we've had, this talk really emerged because some folks in our church just started getting together talking about race, and what they said was they were discovering there's this thing called white privilege that they've had, and they didn't even know that we had it, right? Like we had all these privileges. I didn't think about privilege. Growing up, I would not have said I was a person of privilege. My father never went to college. We lived in a trailer until I was in the 5th grade, and my parents finally saved up, bought a ranch-style house. And so I wouldn't have thought that I was a privileged person, but I was a very privileged person because I was white, I was a guy. I remember hearing about Martin Luther King. There was an amusement park that he and his family wanted to go to, and of course they couldn't go to it because of the color of their skin. I was never kept out of an amusement. I had all kinds of privileges that I didn't even realize that I have. Why do you think it's important for us to realize the stuff that we don't know about ourselves? And we can just get embarrassed about it, but I mean...
Yeah. I mean, and one thing I should say is it's not that I've seen it all or know it all either. And some of the first steps I took in this were people calling me out on things, and I'm probably not even going to tell that one of the embarrassing stories. It's in another book. But I write about some of these things sometimes to show I'm right there on the spot. I don't know it all, and I'm kind of struggling. And part of the answer for me is philosophical curiosity is where it started. It became much more personal, and it, in the sense of realizing things about myself that I got called out on, and then becoming a parent and thinking, I have 2 little girls, 2 little white girls, and they're going to grow up and learn how to be not just girls, but white girls. And as a mother, I was thinking, well, how do I think, you do these things, should I buy everything in pink or everything in blue? And you make some of those decisions or think about that. And I was like, what is she going to be learning about whiteness? How am I going to help her learn how to be a white girl? And then let me just say, if you say that to people, it scares them to death. You sound like a bad white person. You sound like a racist. I actually talked to preschool teachers at Penn State, and I was talking to child development educators at Penn State as I was working on one of the chapters in the book. It's like, where's the research and the help for me to think about how to raise a white child as white? and the freaked out panic in their eyes. You know, it's contained, and they thought they were pretty, like they know me, I'm a parent, I'm a chair of the department, they thought I was okay, and I just said this thing that sounded like I was from the Klan. And I used to joke with my husband, I had my little speech, I would reassure them, no. But if our kids, so it became very personal as a parent, as a teacher, working with college students, how, you know, we don't just pop into existence as 18 knowing things unconsciously about whiteness. You learn these things as children, and how is that getting learned? And I began to realize as a parent, I felt like I had I still don't. I don't know exactly what to say or when. I've stuck my foot in my mouth. I wonder sometimes if I made things worse rather than better. And then it got me reflecting on my relationship with my parents and how little white families talk about race at all. And I'm not blaming them, but I'm just saying I have zero sets of habits or models of how to be a white person thinking about my race in anti-racist ways or just any old ways except being silent. Be silent to show that you're not one of the bad white people. And then I'll stop here in a minute because I'm talking too long, but then sort of the more I start thinking about, well, how and what ways did I then learn to be white? Because surely I have, so then you start thinking about your childhood a little bit, and it does wrap into class issues. I began to see some of the shame of being poor when my parents were young, certainly, but even into my young days, and how that shame about being poor and class differences really fed into then the way my parents managed being white. Of course, none of this ever talked about. So I began to see how all of a sudden the way my parents, I had a great family and we grew up, everything's great. I have no bad stories to tell you. But I began to see how whiteness inflected with class and a desire to make sure we were middle class and had kind of pulled ourselves up, how this had really shaped a lot of relationships, things I still can't talk to my parents about, and I start wondering, what are my children picking up? What are they learning? What's happening in the silences, and how do I begin to break into those? And it's awkward, this is a very personal thing I'm grappling with. Hopefully it's not just navel gazing, but it's picking up on issues that I think a lot of white people in the United States, I suspect a lot of this operates in white people's lives, but we just don't know how to talk about it. And it feels, what's the word? I feel poor in a different way. I feel like I need things to live a richer life, and I don't have those to do it.
So would you agree with the premise of our group that they say before, church people are always wanting to go do good and to help people in the world and all this. Before we go try to connect with people that are different in the community, the first thing we've got to do is figure out ourselves. We have to do some navel gazing, if you will. I wrote a little review of the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, Between the World and Me. When I wrote about it, I got some kind of fiery emails back that were pretty angry. And they were sort of saying, well, let this guy tell us what to do. What does he think we ought to do? And my answer was, he doesn't think you ought to do anything. He's just telling you what it's like to be an African-American person in this country. If you know African-American people, you can learn exactly the same thing. And I've told these stories before, but they're interesting. A friend of mine who's an African-American pastor was driving his Mercedes downtown, and he'd come from the Y, and he had a hoodie on and was sweaty. Policeman pulled him over and said, "Where'd you get that car?" Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then I have another friend who's an African-American pastor of probably the largest church in Charlotte, and he was at the Ritz-Carlton down in Miami. And he was dressed, getting ready to check in the hotel, and the guy in front of him finished talking to the guy at the register, and he turned to Claude and said, "Carry my bags up to 304. And Claude said, "I'd be happy to do that, but why did you ask me that?" Do you think that's right, that we need to work on ourselves before we try to reach out to others?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. I think some of what this book is about is that a lot of the things that we white people know we're supposed to do in order to help, or at least not make any worse problems with racism, turn out in many cases to be wrong-headed and and so in some ways the book feels, one person described it as feeling like a reductio ad absurdum, just ridiculous things she thought I was saying, that you wouldn't try to be friends with black people. And I'm not saying kill your friendships with black people, but I'm worried about that being used as a way of showing that you're a good white person. Well, what would it mean to turn to white communities themselves and have conversations about race and class? And I think these have to be kind of conversations that intersect those issues, because I think white people pretty much across the board in the U.S. have white privilege, but and I'm not trying to get into like a competition of more and less, but it happens in different ways and different degrees for different people. And there's a lot of dumping on poor white people that middle-class white people, middle-upper-class white people do in order to just sort of to ensure their status as one of the good ones. And so I'm concerned about dumping on, I'm concerned about how people of color and poor white people get used in this sort of game, so to speak. The good white people.
I'll just, a little pet peeve of mine. I tell these seeds now and then, like saying, "Oh, bless her heart." Like, try to go a year without saying that. My other one is, this happens all the time on various topics. People say, "Oh, I have a lot of friends who are," fill in the blank. "Oh, I have a lot of friends who are black, but," and then they tell you something. Or, "I have a lot of friends who are gay, but," I just, wherever that sentence goes, I never like where it goes. And I don't know why, that's just kind of me. Inevitably, it goes to defend something that, do we really want to defend it? So you talk a lot in here about white privilege, and it's even something you say that we're fond of and that we want to hang on to. I'm trying to think about that. We say dumb things, and sometimes they're rooted in really lovely things. So in 1986, I was pastor of a very poor church here in Northeast Charlotte. And the neighborhood had changed, and there were few white people left, and mostly black people had moved into the neighborhood. So the church was like, well, what will we do? Because black people were showing up at church. So we're having a conversation. It's a ridiculous conversation, right? But we're having a conversation about this, and my sweetest, kindest, most tender, loving person said to me, she said, "We should accept them into our church." She said, "When I see a black person, I think, there but by the grace of God go I." So she had pity, a kind of tender, loving pity, but then that assumes that we're up and they're down. A lot of our mission work is like, we're up and they're down. And we're pushing a new model of mission on you. I don't know if you've noticed this, that it's not the haves going out to help the have-nots, because then what we're always doing is we're always making demeaning remarks to the people that we say we're going out to help. We're always saying, "You're the problem, we're the answer to your problem." We just do this all the time. Talk about that. You say things like that we don't have any intention of ending white domination, we just want to make it more palatable. Or you talk about the way that we tend to have a sense of the moral goodness of us whites versus maybe not as great a moral goodness in the black community. It's hard to talk about, but
yeah, it's hard to talk about.
You write it at the beginning of your book, so talk to us.
So some of the hardest stuff I say in here is I think a lot of things that white people do, supposedly to address racism or at least seem non-racist, really are about performing and being perceived, one's moral goodness being performed and perceived by others. And so it doesn't take particularly a religious thrust in the book, but it could. But I talk about a kind of soul work that needs to be done and the need to give up on being a good white person. I mean, if you really, really give up on colorblindness and start seeing and talking and noticing not just race, which too often means talking about people of other races if you're a white person, really start talking about your whiteness, really go into, I don't know, you're at the grocery store, you're sitting at the Thanksgiving table, you're in your church groups, and you start naming and talking about when and how whiteness and white class privilege is functioning. This will make people very uncomfortable. It's likely to make you sound like a bad white person. It'll make you sound like, like me walking in to talk to child development, the educators at Penn State. Help me learn how to raise my white children as white in anti-racist ways, but I want to think about their whiteness and be more deliberate and explicit in helping them be white. That sounds awful. And there are places in this book that you can lift out of context that sound really bad. But you know what? White kids today are going to grow up to be white adults. We don't really get to choose that. 100, 200 years from now, race might have changed so much that what we call whiteness doesn't exist, but it does now. And right now in our lifetimes, it's not going to immediately go away. So kids are learning through our silences, through our body language about, God, there's some interesting stories other people tell about, this would be in a city like New York or someplace. Charlotte's not always walkable enough for this, but moms with their strollers, and who do they steer around and avoid, when you're out in the city strolling with your kids, and kids picking up on how you stay away from dangerous things and dangerous people without the parents having to say anything. They're learning all kinds of messages about race and privilege. And you're going to risk sounding like a bad white person if you start naming that. But that's part of what the book asks us to do, is give up being a good white person. Now, I guess real quickly I need to say, there need to be more alternatives than good versus bad here. So part of what the book is calling for is for white people to transform and create what our white identity is. It's a very anemic set of options. The good white person who says the right things, or rather doesn't say certain things, to be perceived as morally good. And then there are the bad white people that get dumped on. It's real easy to, and these tend to be poor white people. It tends to get real easy to pick out people like Dylan Roof. He gets to mark the bad whiteness, and we can be sure that we're the good white people. And that divide, I think, does a lot of harm. And so what would it mean to figure out how to live one's whiteness in different ways?
So you're new to Charlotte, so let me ask you, do you know who Cam Newton is?
I do. Only as of this fall, but I do. Big fan.
So to me, this is really fascinating.
And he's been saying some things recently.
How in the past couple of weeks, we're kind of getting a lesson in race from this fairly odd, interesting, amazing athlete. Talk about what you've kind of seen in that. What is that?
Well, I'll admit, you can probably tell me more than I know, and I'm limited in part to like what I've been reading in the Charlotte Observer. But that he said, look, I'm an African American quarterback, and people aren't used to seeing that. And I can't remember how explicit he was, but saying, look, don't criticize the way I celebrate at the end when a touchdown is made. It's not hood, it's not thug, it's not, it's my way of celebrating, and we're not used to seeing. We have to, he's asking us to confront how race is operating in sports fandom, in football.
But it's been interesting, but not in a heavy-handed, moralistic way. He's not scolding anyone, he's not preaching at anyone, but he's just sort of lightly raising the issue. It's interesting. So here's the thing. Your book isn't written from the perspective of faith or God or any of that. But we have two things going on in Christianity that are, I think, really interesting for us who are in this room. And let me talk about them and then have you reflect on these. So the two things that go on in the Bible all the time that if we take both of them seriously, it's really hard for those of us in this room. I know most of you fairly well. One is the Bible is just kind of death on privilege. People that are privileged, the Bible just says, oh, that's a huge problem. That's just a huge problem. Just on almost every page, throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, Jesus teaching, people of privilege are just at grave risk. And the sense of it seems to be you need to give up your privileges. You shouldn't hold on to any privileges that you have. And we're very, very privileged people, and we don't like to give up those privileges. When I did I did a program on Pope Francis here last month. And what's fascinating about Pope Francis is that's probably in the religion world, that's as privileged as you get, right? Right? You're the Pope. But he's given up the privilege of the limousine for the Ford Focus. He's given up the papal apartments decorated with the Raphael frescoes for a modest house where guest priests live. He's given up the very fancy regalia to live with what everybody else has. So he's given up privilege. So there's something in that in Christianity. The thing that goes alongside that in Christianity is on every page of the Bible, there's big stuff about welcoming the stranger, welcoming the sojourner. And I don't think it's talking about politeness, that if someone is in your circle, you happen to be polite to them. I think it's really talking about welcoming them into your world. Things like when you're gleaning, Old Testament, when you're gleaning your field, and these weren't big wealthy farmers. These are people barely making it. When you glean your field, don't take all of it for yourself. And they needed all of it just to get by. But don't take it all. Leave some, because somebody might come along who doesn't have any food at all. The strangers will come among you. There will be Edomites, and there will be Babylonians, and there will be Moabites, and all kinds of people are going to wander in. And you don't just, you don't shun them. You don't treat them like they're strangers. You let them in. They become part of your family. You eat with them. There's total sharing. And this is hard for people like us, because it doesn't come naturally to us. We want to cling to our privilege. If you could wave a magic wand, I assume in your work you want to, I don't know this about you, but I'd guess. Like you could have studied, like if you're in philosophy, you could have done like the history of Socrates or something. You know, all kinds of things you could have done, or Kant or whatever, interesting stuff. But you've chosen a field that has the potential to change the world. I assume it's something in you wants to change the world. I want to change the world a little. If you could wave a magic wand, and you've been in Charlotte the next 20 years of your life, and maybe I've been here a few more years and been able to do some good, like what would it look like?
Yeah, so that's a hard question. So I have a tangle of things here. I mean, one thing I'll say about the work I do that I think I'm very weak on, that's very important, is institutional and policy type changes. And my work tends to take more of a personal focus. And so, which I think is important. Policies and institutions don't just float out. They didn't get created out of nothing. It's human blood, flesh, human people that created these. And then they often go on to kind of have a life of their own. But if they're going to change, it's going to come through efforts of real flesh and blood people. So I think the personal and political institutional things are very much entangled. And the institutional and the policy, these are important. I'm not good on that front. I tend to have more this personal sort of wanting to talk about changes in the way people think, in interpersonal relationships. When someone walks on that elevator, there's not that tensing up. And then from that, other things can grow. So, I mean, I think if I'm really going to answer your question, 20 years from now, I would talk about the school system and the way resegregation has happened here in Charlotte. What would it mean? Boy, this one gets complicated. I think there's some ways that resegregation can be very harmful, actually, to people of color, and perhaps white people too. The way it happened in my school in Texas in the 80s, we didn't desegregate till then. In the early to mid 80s, there were the three high schools. There were two white high schools and the black-brown high school. The black-brown one's very, very poor, literally on the other side of the tracks. Finally, grudgingly in the 80s, okay, we're going to segregate, and all the white people pat themselves on the back because no one wanted to do this. We're finally going to do it. So they closed down the black-brown high school, Hispanic black high school, sprinkled those other kids in the white high schools, and they lost the black and Hispanic folks in my town lost a kind of home base where they got a break. I mean, they were sprinkled into other schools as kind of the token students of color. And life in some ways they were the ones that were bused. Life got a lot harder for them. It would have been far better to leave all the schools in place and change the way schools were funded so that they had equal funding. But that was the thing no one was going to do. So, okay, so there are ways of doing this that are harmful. Segregation isn't always bad. God, boy, take that out of context. Doesn't sound awful. Segregation's not always bad. Desegregation's not always good. But the way Charlotte had done it, from what I'm reading from Amy Hahn Nelson and others, it happened in really good and interesting ways here. What would it mean to tackle resegregation here and the huge disparities of poverty that are popping up in the school system here? That's going to take more than just spiritual change, soul change on the part of individual people, but that kind of change might help motivate some action. So I would look at the school system. I would look, boy, I have no idea what toes I'm stepping on here. I would look at what's happening when the light rail runs up to Charlotte, up to the university, which we're all so excited about. What's going to happen to North Tryon? And are all the poor people going to get pushed out? And is the homeless shelter there going to get pushed way out to the outskirts of town? Are there ways that the light rail being finished and the development that's inevitably going to go around there doesn't just push poor people out of the way? That would be one thing I'd love to see in 20 years. Now, I'm a philosopher. I don't exactly know how to work policies in Charlotte. I bet some of you might. So I don't know how to make this happen, but in 20 years, I would want to see what the schools look like in terms of disparities that are both race and money. And I'd want to see what happens to that strip of development there, and what happens to the poor pockets. Do they just get sort of forgot or pushed out of the way?
Gee. So you skipped ahead to my last topic, which is about the schools, which is good. And it occurs to me a lot of times, I've been involved in a lot of this stuff around Charlotte for a long time. We almost always talk at the policy level and don't talk very well at the level of the individual heart and soul. And so then we have policies that say you go to this school and you go to this school, but no one's hearts are changed. And so then, my daughter Grace went to Northwest School of the Arts. We thought, oh, this is cool. This is like a 50-50 race school. She's an integrated school. I would pop over there for lunch. Hearts were not changed because when you go to lunch, all the African-American students were sitting on one side of the room and all the white students were sitting. They were in the same building, but they were not connected at all. And I've shared with you many times this famous Martin Luther King quote that, you can have your elbows together, but your hearts are far apart. So desegregation in and of itself is pretty empty and hollow. It's about a change of heart. And so we need people to be working on the change of heart, because I tend to believe if our hearts were right, the policy would be easy to figure out. And we'd be happy to raise our hands to be part of a change policy if our hearts were converted and we wanted what was good for everybody in the community instead of to cling to our privilege, right? So we need the change of heart. Something that worries me now, I'll step on toes. You haven't begun to stomp on toes like I'm capable of doing, and I may be doing here in just a moment. When I watch, see if I can say this artfully, I'm watching the presidential campaign at the moment, which has got to be the most embarrassing one of my lifetime, just at every level, right? It's just, is this the best we can do? But we're getting what we asked for. Like, you can't blame anybody but ourselves. We're getting totally what we've asked for. We're getting totally what we demand. There's a strain in it that puzzles me. And there's this, people are so angry. There's this intense anger. And it almost sounds as if ISIS has made it to Harrisburg, and they'll be in Charlotte by morning. Right? It sounds really bad that people are so upset. But one of the strains that I hear in it is interesting is we're talking tonight about how you talk. And do you say dumb things about other people? Well, one of the backlashes that I'm hearing is there's this kind of mockery of PC, right? People are like, I'm tired of political correctness. There's this kind of rage against this. And I find that I would also want to rage against a political correctness that is nothing but biting your tongue and saying what you think is the right thing to say. I'm not too interested in that. It's fine. It's sometimes good to bite your tongue. Sometimes people are talking to me. I wish they'd bite their tongue. It's fine. It happens all the time. But what we're looking for is right? It's a change of heart. We're actually know and care. I love Lisa. I'm not inclined to say very ugly things about her. Now, am I? I'm going to say admiring things about her because I know her, I care about her, I know about her lives, right? So how do we build these kinds of relationships? So what do you make of this political climate where there's so much anger, and a lot of it has racial overtones that are not subtle.
Right.
They're not subtle. They are not subtle at all. What do you make of that in terms of good white people? These are good white people that are angry, right?
I think there's a fascinating opportunity here to have some honest conversations in our nation about these issues that hasn't happened yet, but that the political debates and the climate right now could help produce. This anger about we're tired of everyone being PC. There's a truth in a way to that anger, calling out that respect for people of color, if I can stick to the issue of race, although sometimes PC stuff's about all kinds of things, gay, straight, whatever. But there have been a bunch of people pretending to have respect for people of color And these tend to be the good white people, that they can use this to demonstrate that they're the good white ones and put down the other white people who are supposedly the bad one. And this is being called out. And so, I mean, it gets to this issue, was there ever really the kind of respect for people of color there in the first place? And the ugly truth, I think, that's being exposed is there wasn't that much. So I don't think saying rude, racist things is the answer, and I'm hoping that some of what happens in the United States is real respect, not just being politically correct, which means like basically not saying what you really think, but we all know what you really think, and just calling people out on that. So where and when and how is there this real respect? And we have so far to go, I think, and that's part of what we're seeing right now. Part of what you were saying earlier when you were asking me about this part of the book where I say, we say we want to not be racist, we white people, we say we don't. Well, you're supposed to not want your white privilege. But there's so much of our sense of self-worth that is built up on comparing ourselves to others that are lower, and that's raced and classed. And if that comparison and that hierarchy went away, if our self-worth is built out of that and we lose it, you know, there's a sense of what do we have left. And so I use the word toxic even there sometimes. There's a lot about whiteness that's really toxic and is built on building ourselves up by tearing other people down. People of color and poor, and it's important to acknowledge the way this happens across poor white people too being dumped on. And if that stopped, and so that's part of the anger I think that's happening there. I'm maybe sounding too generous in a way there, but I think there's a lot of white people saying, shut up, because we know you don't really mean this, and we're tired of you lording this over as if you're morally superior to us. We're going to speak this truth that we think most white people probably think, and we have the guts to say it, and we're tired of being quiet. So I'm not agreeing with the racism that's often there in some of those remarks, but it's pulling an ugly truth out there on the table for us to look at. Now, what we're going to do with that as a nation, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, my only optimism is that somehow you could get those people to have a conversation with Coates, right? They're saying, we're tired of not telling how we feel, and he's saying, I'm tired of not telling what it's like. Our African-American life is like. And if you could get those people to talk to each other and hear each other, there could actually be a lot of healing that could come. We've kind of had pretend desegregation for a long time, so that actually be... you use the word toxic. So thinking about a church and our work, a book that a lot of us read a few years ago called Toxic Charity, it's been improved upon now by a book that I just reviewed for Christian Century by Sam Wells called The Nazareth Manifesto. And he talks in there about the kinds of mistakes that we often make in churches. As I mentioned before, you know, we're the haves, we're going to go solve the problems for people over there, and we kind of send charity somewhere. And in Toxic Charity, we learned that's actually toxic. You're actually harming people in the other situation. Now, I know people who are more than delighted to hear that. So they say, well, just stay in our church. We don't want to do any harm to anyone out there, right?
Yeah,
and Sam Wells says, like, you can have that option as like a person, but Jesus doesn't give you that option. So Jesus doesn't give you the option of top-down toxic charity, but he also doesn't give you the option of staying in your church building. The option that Jesus gives you, the only one, is that you go out and you connect with other people and you befriend them. And everybody's lives are changed because of this. You're with other people more than you're doing for other people. So a really new way of reconceiving how we do church. I'm hopeful about it. And in terms of race, it's going to be really, really important because we tend to get, sometimes we get these views. I remember when Thomas More was here, did music at Church on the Round, you know. I remember I used to want to strangle him because we had our program with South Tryon Community Church, and he was saying, I'm not supportive of that. I'm like, how could you not support our work at South Tryon? There's a little church that's over in off South Tryon, predictably. And what he said, it's hard to talk up here off the cuff more than you know. And what he said actually was a wonderful point. He said, when people like Myers Park decide, okay, we want to engage some people who are African American, let's go to South Tryon. He says that underlines every stereotype that you have about what African American people are like, right? Because in that neighborhood, there are a lot of drug addicts, there are people that are on the street, there are people that say, oh yeah, that's the black community. And it's just the worst kind of thing that we can do, which is why I love to tell the story of my friend who got asked to carry the luggage at the Ritz-Carlton down in Miami. Interesting. You and I could talk for a long time, and I've really enjoyed that, but we got some really sharp people here. What I want to do is see what, I have strict rules on this. I don't want you to stand up and make a speech, but I would love it if you have a question. You can ask me if you want, but really, Shannon's our guest tonight. So if you have a question for Shannon, and I'm sure you do. Yes.
Shannon, it's terrific that you're here.
Thank you.
And the black and white thinking engineer in me is thankful that there are people in the world like you who think very differently.
He needs to stand up to at least.
He's doing a speech already, so he's.
They can't hear you.
We'll repeat it as best we can. He's thanking her for being here.
I'll ask my question. When you talk about whiteness, I receive that as I'm to apologize for being white.
Yeah, no.
He said, when I talk about whiteness, it sounds like I'm supposed to apologize for being white, but no.
Yeah, no. Yeah, we haven't got, so, yeah,
Good
no.
question.
Good, that's a really good question. Yet another moment in the book where I sound like a bad white person, but I have a whole so at least in the academic circles I roam around in, but I think this fits with so-called everyday real life too. Usually what I see is white people called to show that they feel guilty or ashamed for being white. So that would be the apology. And sometimes even the language race traitor gets used. If whiteness means oppressing people, you need to be a traitor to your race, betray your whiteness. Maybe even try to abolish whiteness. Don't, end it, apologize for it. Very negative affects at work here. And I'm very suspicious of that. I think there is a lot in our history as white people that is shameful. So moments of shame will happen, yes. Cultivating that as the energy that's going to propel white people to engage with these hard issues where you're doing self-searching and talking to other people, and I don't think guilt, shame, the apology is the right route. I think it's too easy to feel like, okay, I apologize, now I'm done, move on. And that there has to be, brace yourselves, I talk about a kind of white self-love that this has to come out of, that there has to be some kind of love, some kind of way of finding, and this is not, please read the book if this, just to know that this means being critical of a lot of stuff that's out there that is white, that's done in the name of whiteness. It's loving ourselves. I mean, I really get back to things. I'm talking about my parents. I'm talking about my grandparents. I'm talking about my kids. They're all white, and I'm talking about loving them so much that I want us and them to not be toxic in these ways that we've been talking about. So it's a love that's asking for a transformation, but it's coming out of a love that's facing up to suffering and trying to find some joy in life, and that just appealing to guilt, I think white people are going to burn on that real fast. Just burn out and not stay with it. I also think it's an emotion that is easier for middle and upper class white people to display. When you're already a failed white person, white trash, air quoting there. When you're already a failed white person, some of this guilt stuff just if you're a poor white person, you're already struggling with so much shame in this country. And how to pull out of that shame for just being poor. That for someone to come along and say, oh, and now let's add another heap of shame on top of you. It's like, that is not going to get traction with a lot of. So this guilt and shame starts to feel kind of like a luxury for those who aren't poor, to be very quick on the point and frank. So there's got to be, if this is something that's going to engage a wide swath of white people, not just the good white people, there's got to be some different energy. So no. You may have specific things, I might have specific things we need to apologize to other people about, yes, but just being a white person, you got to acknowledge that. And then really in some ways this whole book is me wrestling with this question, so how are you going to live as a white person? How am I going to live as a white person? And sticking that white in there feels uncomfortable. Not taking that life raft of colorblindness, but saying, you know what? I'm a white person whether I like it or not. How am I going to live that way? What is that going to mean? How's that going to impact other people?
One way I answered that question a few years ago is I said, don't apologize for being white, but be aware that if you're African American or let's say Jewish or any number of other things, you have felt like you've had to apologize for all of your life, right? I read a book by this Jewish novelist. He said, growing up Jewish in an anti-Semitic culture, he said that what happens is you're always afraid you'll make any little mistake. Like, if you're the dominant culture, you don't worry about making a mistake, you just kind of make a mistake. But if you're a suspect person and you make any mistake, like, you know your parents are going to get all over you. And what they tend to say is they'll think all of us are terrible if you just make one little mistake, right? And so they've had to kind of live with that all their lives, having to apologize. All right, another question.
Real quick, one of our white privileges is getting to be individuals. Some white person, Dylan Roof, commits a crime, and we don't go, oh, there go the white people again. Watch out. They're all going to do that. We don't do that. So talk about giving up a white privilege. What would it mean to think of yourself as, yes, in some sense we're all individuals, but to think of yourself as fundamentally part of a social group, and that a racial group, and that when one white person does something out there in the world, that reflects back on you too. So what Dylan Roof did was not over there this crazy thing that we don't know how to make sense of. He's enacting in, granted, an exaggerated way in some ways. He's enacting and speaking explicitly things that a lot of white people feel, and he's not so different than us. What does it mean to own him as a white person and say, wow, how am I going to now be in the world in a way to reduce the toxic stuff that white people are doing? It doesn't get much more toxic than Dylan Roof, but, he and I are there in that same group of whiteness together.
The second hand I saw was yours.
Trying to think how to phrase this on top of that, too. I was just struck by the idea of the poor white trash and sort of them being the bad white people, maybe, and I just didn't know if you had something more to say about that. That really stuck with me.
She's asking about more on the bad white trash.
Yeah, there are a lot of, I'm just going to unload a bunch of stereotypes here. It's going to sound awful, but there's an assumption that the white people who are the problem, who cause the racism nowadays, are the uneducated ones. And that tends to get lumped together with poor. So these poor, uneducated, lower-class white people don't know any better, are still hanging on to those racist ways. They're the problem, we're not. This goes way back. There's a historian who talks about after the Civil War, he called it the grits thesis. So wealthy white people after the Civil War in the South would explain to the Northerners, we're really not that awful, we're not that racist. They're trying to repair relationships after the Civil War. It's those poor, stupid ones. They're the white ones in the South that are the problem. So he calls it the grits thesis. But you see this dumping that goes on over and over again, that they're the problem, we're not. They're stupid, they're uneducated, they're just, they don't have the right kind of taste, they don't live the right kinds of lives, whatever. And there's almost a conflation that starts to happen between being poor white person, boy, throw in Southerner there. I do talk about regional stuff in here, which, as you can tell, I'm very interested in. Poor rural Southerner starts to conflate with white supremacist. If you're not one yet, that's where they're recruiting from or something. So you get the rednecks and the white trash. They're the problems. It's not us. And you start drawing that line, and it alleviates the good white people from really having to think about this. It also, again, it's the dumping ground where both that toxic kind of raising ourselves up by dumping on these folks over here.
Yes.
Does age make a difference? I'm thinking of people for whom Selma is memory versus people for whom it's just a page in a history book.
Does age make a difference?
That's a really interesting question.
What was the question?
Does age make a difference?
Like if Selma is something you remember versus you're reading about it in a history book. Tell me more. I haven't done a lot with age on this, except to think about raising white kids, but tell me more.
I'm fishing for some optimism.
Yeah.
We're very optimistic tonight.
That people who are grown up differently aren't carrying as much baggage, and they're just going to be more relaxed about relationships than those who have seen all the turmoil of the 60s and so forth. Am I imagining this, or is there some substance to that?
That's a really good question. I don't know. You do hear of kids mixing together in ways, not having some of the same baggage, that other things are possible, and I do think that's true. I also think it can be really easy for all of us to have habits of the self that get sedimented, racial and otherwise, but we can stick with race. These habits can get sedimented and get hard to change. I'm not, there's some philosophers that say you just kind of have to wait for some generations to die off. I'm not that pessimistic. But it can get harder to change. Things can get sedimented. I don't think that just sitting back and saying that things naturally are going to get better because the younger generation is sort of a little looser or doesn't have the same memories of Jim Crow, for example, that somehow that it's all going to take care of itself. I don't think that's the case. And in fact, if you start looking at, I don't have them to rattle off to you right now, but I could find them for you in some of the things. If you start looking at a lot of different statistics, things are worse now than they were about 50 years ago in the age of Jim Crow. If you start looking at racial disparities in health, if you look at racial disparities in wealth, they are worse than they were. If you look at, I actually did bring these in case it came up, if you look at incarceration rates by race across the various states, it is worse now than it used to be. If there's one book I could recommend to you, actually there's more than one, but Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow, which talks about incarceration in the United States, everything on almost every front, things that were legal in the days of Jim Crow, in terms of pulling away voting rights, ability to vote, ability to get housing, ability to get various forms of aid, these can legally be stripped from people after they've been convicted of a crime, and you start looking at what's happening. Anyway, read her book, The New Jim Crow. It will not give you optimism, but so it will actually scare you a little bit probably, because it shows how in these unconscious ways that aren't as obvious in the days of Jim Crow, just as many harms, if not more, are being perpetuated around these sort of race lines. So I actually don't think despair is in order, but it's not just because kids are going to automatically, they're growing up in a world that has a lot of racial disparity and inequality. It takes a different form, but if you look at the statistics, it's just as severe as the days of Jim Crow.
In Charlotte, Mecklenburg, you're less likely, if you're a white child going to a public school, you're less likely to meet or befriend an African-American child than you were 20 years ago. Clearly. There's no question. Yes. Yes, please.
I would like to offer an observation. My son goes to a school where he's actually a racial minority. He's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little kid. And I was at a school event about 3-4 weeks ago, and his teacher segmented the kids into groups. And the girls were all kind of racially mixed, and the boys were segmented in a way so that my Caucasian son was grouped with an Asian American and an Asian kid, and the 4 black kids were grouped together. And I said to my son's teacher, I said, do you always separate the boys by race? Do you always separate the non-Caucasian, the black kids, from the Asian or Indo-Asian or Caucasian kids? And he said it never even occurred to him that he'd done that. And so when we think about our race and our privilege, we really have to be willing to question these situations, because he's not a bad guy. He's not a bad
Yeah.
But he just did it because that's kind of what you do. And for me, that was huge.
That's a great example of how
Some
there are a
people
lot
probably
of
couldn't hear that, so
yeah.
that's the reason we say.
Do you want to
just can't
repeat
hear
it? Go ahead.
She was saying that her child's class, that she was there, and sounds like a multi-ethnic class, and your child is a minority child, but being a white, blonde, blue-haired child. So the teacher was splitting the kids up into small groups, and she put all the African-American boys in one circle. And when asked about it, the teacher said, I didn't notice I did that. Right, so.
And it's an interesting example of, it's an interesting example of how in these unspoken ways, race is playing out in kids' lives all the time. It doesn't have to and it doesn't mean that someone's being mean or bad, but that none of us are untouched. No matter what your race is out there, we're all being taught things about race as we grow up, and they can simmer and hum along. Talking about them doesn't magically make them go away. witness some of the political dialogue we were just talking about. But at least if it's out there on the table, you can sort of talk about it and think about, geez, do we want to have race operating in different ways in our lives? And those are uncomfortable conversations sometimes. And it takes courage to be a parent to bring up race and say, why did you just racially divide? And, the teacher might have been defensive or not, but, well, that's good if he wasn't or she wasn't. It's hard to bring up those conversations. I was thinking of what you were saying about not engaging in toxic charity. And one of the things you can do is you don't have to go to other places or other churches or other communities. In your own neighborhoods, in your own communities, in your own families, what would it mean to start talking about race, white class privilege? Let me just say that's the hardest place to do that. I think sometimes I write books because it's hard to talk to my parents about this still. But this is, let me just say also, this is the stuff, when I said that, like Stokely Carmichael, and there's this chapter in Black Power from like the 1966 or something, maybe older. It is like one of the best things you could read today. And it's this part where he talks about how coalitions between black and white people might become possible. And he says, white people, go back to your own spaces and do your work there. We don't need you coming to help us here. Go back to your homes and neighborhoods and communities and talk about race there. Here in South Charlotte, what would that, that's uncomfortable. But there is where we are really equipped to do some serious work. Right here in this section of Charlotte.
All right, questions for Shannon? Richard.
Yes, as I was sitting here, just a real quick observation, and you were saying about embracing the whiteness, and which is, I think, is a great concept. But I was thinking, as a perspective from a black man, when we do that and teach our kids that and say, embrace your blackness, that's often perceived as nefarious, you see? And so it gets back to that hearts thing.
Yeah.
Embracing heart. But my one question, how much do you think that slavery and the history of slavery should come into any conversation when we're talking about bringing hearts and minds together?
Yeah.
So Richard said that embracing whiteness sounds cool. We might get a little anxious if African Americans start embracing their blackness. But then he asked, what's the role that maybe slavery still is playing?
History of slavery. When you first started asking the question about the history of slavery, you didn't say this, but what I heard immediately was talking with children about this. But it could be a broader point. I'll come back to the broader point. This is one of the things we're still really literally in the book. I say, please, colleagues working in child development, we need help here. How do I start talking to my 7-year-old white daughter about race? Like, I don't want her to grow up colorblind, and surely she's already picking stuff up. When, the history of whiteness and slavery is horrific in this country. What exactly, when, how do you talk about little kids being ripped away from their mother's arms? I don't know. So I think the answer is yes, it has to be in there. Especially talking with children, I struggle. I will do a call out to the education department at UNC Charlotte. There are 2 women there who are doing some work on this issue around whiteness and around children and how, in a teaching context, when and how do you talk about horror and terror? Because that's what slavery was, and that's what the history of whiteness is to a large degree. How do you talk about that with kids? Okay, but more broadly, yeah, I'm a big fan of that Faulkner saying that, the past isn't past, The history isn't, I'm botching it now, but y'all know which one I'm talking about. The past isn't over, it isn't really even past yet. I think that there are all kinds of ways that the history of slavery lives on today. I think it has to be talked about. How and in what context, in different ways. Yeah, that would, how old, so sorry to cut to the nuts and bolts here. How old is your building? When was it built?
Well, late 20s, the oldest part of it.
The late 20s?
Yeah.
Okay, 1920s. So I start thinking, so this is different than the church, but I start thinking about what a lot of universities have been thinking about. And when you dial back to some of the most prestigious universities in the United States, and you start talking about, and there are now starting to be some conversations and books written about it. So who put those stones in the building? And who built the bricks that went into those stones? And who took, this is slave labor that built up massive institutions in our, so maybe it's not this literal building, but we live and walk among the echoes of slavery all the time. And then the wealth that accumulated from that. And then even little things like, this is right after slavery, but I'm reading about the Freedmen's Bureau and the bank that was, it's a very interesting history right there when the Freedmen's Bureau was working, and there was a bank set up. And the stuff I'm reading, they still to this day don't know. The bank's open for about 10 years. Massive amounts of money from newly freed slaves put in this bank, and it's gone. It's just gone. Everyone lost their money. So this, there's a history of wealth, of health, that passes on from generation to generation, and we're still living that out. That sounds melodramatic, but it's not. You can, I can point you later to some medical literature that is looking at transgenerational effects of stress around, maybe stress around a number of things, but chronic stress around the effect of racial microaggressions that lives on for generations. That even if right now, sorry, this is going to sound even less optimistic. Even if right now we just eliminated racism, everyone just got a clean heart and a clean mind, and it's gone, for real, really, really, not PC. The effects of it are going to live on for generations. In our bodies, there have been effects that will be passed on. But you look around at distributions of wealth, you look at buildings. I mean, you know how wealth works when you're just investing in your retirement account. A little bit here, and it snowballs, and in 20 years it gets bigger, and it doesn't matter if you start, if you don't start saving to your 60s, you've lost that opportunity. Okay, so put that on a national scale of wealth. It can be just a little bitty bit that got passed on from my family, back in the 17 whatevers or the 1800s. But then that snowballs in terms of, what my family's able to do now. So, sorry.
Yeah. No.
I mean, in the end, where I want to end with is joy, though.
I would.
But we're not there yet. Where's Joy? Yeah, she hasn't shown up yet. My name's Shannon, but I want to end with joy.
I mean, I would add, the things she just described, like, we're always loath to acknowledge this, but theologically, this is one of the things that we believe, right? Is we talk about original sin, and people go, because of what Adam did, we did stupid thinking. But, human sinfulness, human evil perpetuates itself and feeds on itself through generations, and we all fall victim to it quite inevitably. Again, not a conscious choice. It's just like if I say to you, don't be materialistic, you say, okay, you're not going to make it till 9 o'clock tonight. It's just kind of in the fiber of our being, and you can't rid it that easily. Tom.
My question is, it seems to me that the education of the problem is not being discussed. It seems to me that we're talking about it, but how are we going to address the real hurting in this state, in this nation, where there's so much poverty, there's so many people not getting treatment, so many people, like I deal with black families every week, and some of them, one's an alcoholic syndrome baby, another's just got his ankle bracelet off. How are we going to deal with these problems? They're real problems. I don't think people understand how serious the problems are, and I think our focus should be on that and not thinking about how are we going to intellectualize and how are we going to come to grips with our personal situation. Why don't we solve the problem? Why don't we look at it like I just wrote down 9/11. If we can put together some of the figures that are comparable to 9/11, we would say, let's do something. Let's not just let this fester.
He's asking about when can we not just talk about this, but what can we actually do because of the very real problems that people suffer from in our state all the time. You can answer that, then I'll have a go at it also.
No, I mean, that's a fair question, and it's a good question. I guess, and in here in some ways as it gets back to my saying, I don't know how to make the policy changes. I'm not good at that. I am interested in how do we get white people to give a hoot, and to give a hoot for more than just an hour, but to really put the energy into making it. Because, part of it is we have these statistics. We've had them for ages. W.B. Du Bois is fascinating on this. He goes through this shift in his career. The reason I think he's fascinating is he's a sociologist, and he thinks back in the early 1900s, if we could just show white people the realities of what black life is like, that we can get rid of the stereotypes, everyone's going to chip in, we're going to change it. And he slowly kind of realizes you can have all the objective statistics in the world, and we can have a way of not seeing them or ignoring them or not caring. I don't know which one it is or all of those. There's all kinds of, I got them right here if you want them on the incarceration rates. They're horrific. We've got all the medical literature on preterm birth rates, on health, on heart disease. I mean, we know what all of the racism's doing. I mean, so that knowledge there's something else that's needed, because knowing that isn't changing it.
I know some of the statistics, but when I heard this woman talk about when she was the size of the little boy who was in the chair, about 7 or 8 years old, and she said, when I was his age, they picked me up by my ankles and shake me in case I had anything in my pockets. That's different than statistics. You say, I want to do something about that for this little boy. And the question is, how do we educate people so that something happens?
And part of the way I tend to talk about that is, if we look at Jesus as a model of this, how should we say it? Jesus gave direct care to a lot of people, to people that were sick, to people that were hungry. He helped them now. He saw them suffering, and his heart was moved, and he helped them now. But he also seemed keenly interested in helping people to think differently about others, and a lot of his teaching is geared to that. His goal, I think, would be that if everyone thought differently, there wouldn't actually be so much suffering. They would actually all be acting along the way, and then you wouldn't have so much hunger. You wouldn't have these statistics would fundamentally change. So the church's business is never going to be sitting in here I hope not, navel gazing. We need to be in here and realize some things about ourselves. But in the meantime, we're collecting food downstairs. We're doing a lot of stuff now. Our tutoring programs continue, even though we don't have race figured out. We're still going to do the best that we can in all these areas. I think because of a night like this, we're a little humbler when we go at these things. Maybe we engage in it a little differently. Maybe we listen a little more than we did before. But it's no slowing down of the action. If anything, to me, once I've seen people become more aware of these things, they're more zealous to get involved and act and to do something. So I hope it's both and not, we have to pick one or the other. Yes.
Hi, I'm very quiet, so I have to stand up to project. So I have a question. I'm a teacher at a low-income school here in Charlotte.
Which school?
Cochran Collegiate Academy.
Cochran.
It is over 90% Black and Latino, and every day I go to school, I know like my kids are wonderful, and it kills me because they are not getting the same education that I got. I grew up here in Charlotte, went to Mayor's Park, and it kills me. And I'm so excited about the possibility of redistricting and the possibility of my kids getting to go to a better school and having maybe like higher income families bringing resources to our school, and I'm so excited about this possibility. But I feel like I end up in conversations all the time with people saying, well, you know, like we'll figure out other things. We'll figure out funding. We'll figure out this, because our schools are good, and like we don't want to mix with those kids or bring the bad kids here. And I feel like I have to shut down because I don't know how to engage in those conversations. What's your advice?
So, what's your name? I don't.
Hi, I'm Adelia.
So she was saying she's from Myers Park, but she teaches at Cochran, which is indeed a challenging school, and that her children are wonderful. And every time we talk about policy changes or redistricting, she gets excited about that because her kids might have a crack at a better school. But then everybody's explaining away why that's a bad idea. Our program next month is going to be on racial equity in the schools, and Eric Davis, who's our representative, is somebody who has given immense thought to all of this. And he's practical. He tries to think of what's doable, where can you get the votes actually from the school board. This is a hard thing, right? So he's thought long and hard about how to tackle this kind of thing and has some good ideas about it. Dorothy Counts, who's coming, has spent her life thinking about this and has some wonderful thoughts on it. So we'll take that up again next month. But again, that's where we clearly see a huge problem in society. Two things happen. One is we misdiagnose it. So we say, problem kids. But the kids, they're not problem kids. They're wonderful kids, right? So we've blown it already. But then we make the decision that, well, this policy, what it really is we're clinging to privilege, right? Whoever's in a certain school, they say, we're going to cling to our privilege, and if we made a change, we would lose some of our privilege. But again, I just want to say, as Christian people, we're called not to cling to our privilege, but to look for the person that is disenfranchised. That's the charter of the Old Testament. That's the charter of Jesus. That's the charter of the Apostle Paul. It's the charter of the saints through the centuries. We can deny it, and you see it being denied in the election. I mean, the thing that just makes me, I don't know whether to laugh or cry or scream, is, and it goes across both parties, you see people trying to get the Christian vote, right? They're trying to get the Christian vote, and the way they appeal for the Christian vote is it's unholy. They appeal to the antithesis of Christianity to get the Christian vote. So I want to get on the national stage and say, okay, let's just be clear. Here are the ABCs of Christianity, right? Christianity is not mean. Christianity is not judgmental. Christianity is not, we hang on to what we have for ourselves and do let anybody take it from. This is not Christianity. I'm sorry. So it's a tragic time in our country that we've kind of whiffed on all of this. At least some of us in the church are trying to keep people on point on this, but it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle. Thank you for your teaching and life.
Well, and your question makes me think of your question. And again, I don't know if I'm stepping on toes, but I mean, here's where the heart, I bet some of you know how to talk to school board members or how to move some of the levers of policy in this city.
Yep.
I don't doubt that there's some powerful people in this room. So I'm not trying to tell you what your political orientation should be, but I am saying there are things in Charlotte you can do, very concrete things, and one of them could be address what's going on in the segregation and inequalities in the school system. And there are people trying to work on that, and it doesn't just magically happen. It's going to take some political push and pull. In the meanwhile, you didn't say this, but I'm thinking of an example another student brought up to me, a grad student who's a teacher who is in my class. And one thing I would say to you is, one of the best things you can do is not be colorblind in the classroom, and maybe you're not. That a woman who teaches the 7th grade in a very black-brown school, 98% black-brown, in which she was talking about the need for students to be able to trust their teachers. And they had a white teacher who only saw people, didn't see race, and the students were asking some questions and wrestling with things. And she, it was a very hard teaching situation for her because they didn't trust her, that they just basically thought she was a liar, And maybe it means all white people are liars. What do you mean you don't see race? I mean, they see race happening all over their lives. One of the kids was a Hispanic kid, and his mother had just been deported. And he was living with a friend, and he was scared of what might happen with the election and what was going to happen to his family. And he needed to be able to say something about that and not just be told, well, race isn't real and y'all are just people or something. And he needed to be able to have that be something that was recognized in his life. So I think it's hard for white people to know how and when to talk about these things. But one of the best things I think what you can do is, and again, I'm not trying to pinpoint you, but since you stood up and spoke, don't be a liar. We white people are liars a lot of the time. Not on purpose, but we're silent and we think race doesn't matter very much or doesn't have a big impact in our lives or in our society, and we're lying to ourselves. I mean, this is one reason giving up white privilege means going to give up some material advantage. That's part of it. But one way you can think about giving up white privilege is giving up some of the lies, which are just, after lying for a while, it gets deadening and tiring to keep lying. So don't lie to your students, I guess would be one thing I'd say, even if it's going to be really uncomfortable sometimes knowing how to respond to them and, maybe whatever they're bringing up.
Fincher.
This may be difficult for me to say the phrase correctly, but my question is, can good white people be resentful of a race of people? And is that the same thing as being a racist? That is, can you be resentful? And I'll give you an example. Can you be resentful, for example, 7 out of the 10 kids, babies are born out of wedlock, and therefore have no father figure and no family situation to help guide them, and that perpetuates itself without there being any discussion about that by politicians or by anyone of any power in the black community or whatever. It seems to me that there is some blame to be shared in that situation. And it seems to me I hear more and more of that from friends that I believe are good people, but are resentful of the fact that that is the situation we find ourselves in the United States. And it seems to be more of a resentment than a racist situation. Have you dealt with that any?
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, Fincher. I don't know if resentment is the word I'd want to use, but can we name some of the very real problems that we know exist in a particular community? And in this case, he's talking about the African American community, things like the number of children that are born without fathers and so on. Can we talk about that in a way that is not itself racist? Because it's obviously a problem in the world that bears discussion. So how do we talk about it? Yeah.
And the example would be the number of incarcerations that you've spoken about. I forgot the percentage, but like 6 or 7 out of every black man, 6 or 7 black men, 6 or 7 of them are going to spend time in jail. And I trace that right back to the family situation, and I hear no discussion about that situation at all, which I believe is one of the major social problems that we have, leading to not resentment but racism.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm glad you asked this question. I think it's one of these hard questions that most folks would just rather not talk about, or if it does get talked about, kind of maybe in quiet ways off to the side or something. I mean, the way I'd want to address it is to talk about, I don't know if this is maybe just exactly what you'd predict I'd say, but if you do go back to those numbers you were talking about how many black men are incarcerated. So let's say if you're a family that's very poor or relatively poor, and you've got you're living in federal housing. When that father of your child comes back, he can't legally live in the apartment with you, because if you have a convicted criminal living in federal housing, you can get kicked out of your housing. So there are a lot of ways that the laws we have set up pull black families in this case apart. It's not just black families, but we'll stick with that example. That legally the mother and the kid could be homeless, or kids could be homeless, if they allow that black father, that black man back in their lives, living in the same house with them. So things are structured legally right now to pull apart and rip apart black families. So then we got to back up and look at and talk about, frankly, the war on drugs and why the incarceration rates just went through the roof in the 1980s. And here I'll have to just gesture to Michelle Alexander's book. But there's this disproportionate sentencing that's gone on. There are a lot of things that have been publicized. So there are a lot of laws that are in place that legally set up a situation that make it very, very hard for black families to be together if and when they want to be together. So I think you're right that these conversations need to take place. I don't think it means that the black family is sick or diseased or something like that. I think there are a lot of societal forces that make it incredibly difficult for black families to hold together, especially if they're poor black families. And then we go back to, in some sense, the history of slavery and the accumulation of wealth and differences in terms of financial resources along racial lines. Well, it's two things. It's a history of wealth, and when I say wealth, I don't mean people having yachts or whatever. I mean that they might have enough money to do my parents have enough money to kind of cover a modest retirement? Or is the money I'm saving going backward to them to help take care of them in their old age? We don't have yachts. We're not an extremely wealthy family. We kind of do okay. But if my money doesn't have to go backwards to take care of my parents, that little couple of 10,000, whatever, can go forward to pay for my kids' college so that then they're not taking out loans. So, that little bit of, is it going or forward or backward, or have you paying both ways? So they're all, so you've got the wealth accumulation, and then you still to this day, you look at the dollars that people, it breaks up by gender and race, but black women especially get paid something like 68 cents on the dollar for the same job that white men do. So we have all kinds of these things in place that set up an inequality, and then there's a war on drugs that disproportionately put black and brown men in prison for relatively minor drug offenses, very disproportionately. I mean, crack is I'm sure y'all are all familiar with this. Crack is the main example of the different rates of crack versus powder cocaine and the sentencing rates. So one of those tends to be a white drug, at least back in the 80s. One was a more black drug. Vastly different incarceration rates in terms of what happened when you were caught. All kinds of things like this. So there's a lot of stuff that circles around to make it very hard for that family to live together then when he comes out, when he comes out of jail.
And I think about this a couple ways. One is to me, there's nothing that we should fear talking about kind of out of politeness or real problems in society. We need to talk about it. The question is, how do we talk about it? What's the tonality of talking about it? I can't think of a good example, but one that comes to me that kind of hits close to home, let me try to say it carefully, is we have a relationship with South Tryon Community Church, and most of their budget comes from here. And I've heard two different kinds of questions raised about that. I've heard people say, can we trust what they're doing with our money? Well, to phrase the question that way implies stupidity, evil. You know what I'm saying? It's a negative assumption. There's another way to talk about it, which is, do you need help with your annual audit? What ministries can we celebrate? There's another way to talk about the exact same subject without sounding demeaning. The other thing is I always try to remember when things come up, like who's not in the room to give the answer up here. So with this, I think about who's not in the room to answer your question, and that would be the African American clergy that I know. I get bugged sometimes because once in a while I'll get a complaint from somebody out in the world, and they'll say, the church never talks about, and it's something we talk about all the time. They just don't know we talk about it because they don't go to church, right? And they're looking for something in the press, but what do you find in the press? Well, you find sensational things in the press. You find Stephen Furtick's blue jeans in the press. That's kind of what gets in the press. It's sort of like with Islam. I hear this thing over and over that Islamic leaders don't denounce violence in Islam, but actually that's not the case. Actually, Islamic leaders all over the world are constantly on this, but it gets absolutely no coverage. The only thing that gets coverage are the kind of radical clerics who are carrying on. So if my African American clergy friends were here to say, nothing's being said or done about the family, in the churches in Charlotte, and there are big, strong African American churches in Charlotte, they said they have no greater priority than working on precisely this issue. And they outdo us by a long shot. Classes they have on parenting, how men are supposed to behave. We ought to have that at Myers Park, right? Get all the young men of the church, and we should do that, right? How they do. So they're working as hard as they can overtime on this. The clergy families in the African American church, they have to be very visible to the entire congregation to say, like this is how you do it. And they're happy to do that because they're working on it as hard as it's an uphill battle. But they'd say it's not that no one's doing it. They're doing it absolutely as hard as they know how to go at it. But it's hard. It's generational stuff. It's not to excuse it or say that it's good or the rest of us don't have to deal with it because we do. So we have to talk about it. And what do we do about it?
Politicians talked about it, they would hear what she said. The housing situation may be one thing, you never hear it discussed. And if the housing situation apparently is one reason for the breakdown of
That would.
Yep, that could be a law
A
that
lot
could
of
be
what's
changed.
wrong really is easy to change, and it's just
Again,
getting the political will to
It's
talk
not that
about
all
it.
African Americans live in federal housing, but if you start looking at poverty rates, so if there's a decent proportion of African Americans that are poor living in federal housing, they legally cannot rejoin together as a family without risking being kicked out, and then you've got the kids homeless, and so these are then hard decisions that get made about how then do you find alternative ways for the family to be together if he's not living there with them. So strangely enough, this makes me think of Cam Newton again. So, there may be alternate ways of pulling family together that might not look familiar to you and me, but that might be very healthy and make sense. So part of it is kind of realizing, oh, well, wait a minute. So what then, maybe there are other ways of doing family working around these laws that are trying to pull you apart. And then you think, God, you go way back to what a long history of in the United States of forbidding African Americans to be families together. So you couldn't marry in the days of slavery, or sometimes there were like forced marriages that the slave owner, the master, would set up. And then, and then how many times, even if there were kind of something like a family or marriages, you could be sold off. Your kids could be sold off. Your partner could be sold off. So, in some ways, family is one of the most important things, and finding alternative ways sometimes in hard situations to be family. There's been a lot of creativity, but the Cam Newton was, it might not look the usual way perhaps we're used to seeing it.
I hate to do this, but it being 8:30, my self-imposed rule of 90 minutes, I'm going to call time. And I know we probably have 2 more hours of questions. We'll be up here. We'll talk some. Talk among yourselves. If you have a question that was just burning, that was unanswered, if you send it to me, I'll send it to Shannon. If she has time to deal with it, we'll get it back to you, that kind of thing.
Well, and if sometime down the road, I don't mean right away, but if sometime down the road, y'all want me to come back and talk, or
would you want her to come
Sunday
back?
school or something, I'd be happy to. I'm not trying to put pressure. I'm just saying I learn a lot from these discussions. So
you can't preach on Sunday morning, but you can come back.
No, I'm not going to preach. I'm not a preacher, but I learn a lot, and I've enjoyed the questions. So I'd be happy to do that.
We have learned a lot, and we're so grateful for you coming. So join me in thanking her.
Okay, thank you.
And come back on Tuesday, February the 16th. Local hero Dorothy Counts will be with us, Eric Davis, and Sandra Conway. It'll be a great night.